Most people believe that World War II was a clash of steel, a mathematical game of resources and manpower. But if you look closer at the declassified journals of the High Command, you discover a different battlefield. A battlefield where the enemy wasn't across the trench, but inside the skull. In 1944, a decorated German general sat in a bunker, staring at a map of a battle he had already lost. He wasn't afraid of the Allied tanks. He was afraid of a dream he had the night before. A dream of an ancient, faceless king demanding a sacrifice. This is what Carl Jung called the archetypes. While the world was focused on the explosion of bombs, Jung was watching the explosion of the collective unconscious. He believed that the Great War was not a political failure, but a psychological eruption, the moment humanity lost control of its shadow. In this video, we are not going to talk about tactics. We are going to deconstruct the minds of the men who held the world's fate in their hands. We will explore how the concept of the persona allowed spies to live double lives until they forgot who they were, and how the shadow turned ordinary soldiers into monsters. Welcome to the Psychological Archives. This is the art of war, according to Carl Jung. Every soldier is a professional actor. From the moment they put on the uniform, they adopt what Carl Jung called the persona. It is a functional mask, a social skin designed to radiate authority, courage, and indifference to death. But in the theater of total war, this mask becomes a cage. Think of the elite double agents of the 1940s. These men lived inside the persona of the enemy. They spoke their language, shared their meals, and saluted their flags. Jung warned that when we play a role too well, the ego begins to dissolve. The spy doesn't just pretend to be a Nazi. His psyche begins to absorb the archetype of the predator. This is where the true psychological warfare happened. Allied intelligence wasn't just looking for troop movements. They were looking for the cracks in a mask. They knew that under the rigid, iron persona of a German commander, there was a suppressed anima, the emotional, human side that had been starved for years. When a prisoner of war was treated with unexpected kindness, it wasn't a gesture of mercy. It was a calculated psychological strike. By offering a cigarette or a seat at a dinner table, the captor forced the soldier to remove the persona. And once the mask is removed in the middle of a war, the mind breaks. You are no longer a soldier. You are a lost child in a burning world. The military-industrial complex built the tanks, but the persona built the men who drove them. And as Jung observed from his office in Zurich, the more perfect the mask, the more terrifying the demon hidden beneath. To understand the scale of the devastation, we must look beyond the individual. Carl Jung watched the unfolding of the war not as a political event, but as a psychological pandemic. He called it the collective shadow. When a nation feels humiliated, small, or powerless, it doesn't just disappear. That darkness sinks into the unconscious, festering until it finds a vessel. In the 1930s, that vessel was a rigid, absolute ideology that promised to turn the shadow into a sword. Jung observed that when people join a mass movement, they surrender their individual morality to the group. The I becomes we, and in that transition, the personal conscience is extinguished. This is the psychology of the demonized other. By projecting their own internal darkness onto an enemy, a race, a nation, a religion, the soldiers felt they were no longer committing murder. They were cleansing the world. The horror of the Holocaust and the brutal purges of the Eastern Front were not just failures of policy. They were the physical manifestation of the human shadow, allowed to run wild without the restraint of the individual soul. But there is a terrifying paradox in Jungian war. The more you fight a monster, the more you risk becoming one. As the Allied forces pushed toward Berlin, they too had to confront their own collective shadow. To defeat a regime of total darkness, they had to adopt methods of total destruction. The firebombing of Dresden and the atomic flash over Hiroshima were moments where the liberators had to dip their hands into the same dark well as their enemies. Jung argued that in total war, the victor is often the one who integrates their shadow most effectively, but the cost is a permanent stain on the national psyche. The war didn't end when the treaties were signed. The shadow simply went back into hiding. It moved from the trenches into the suburbs, from the battlefield into the silent trauma of the returning veterans. They brought the war home in their nightmares, in their sudden bursts of rage, and in the thousand-yard stare. These men had seen the primordial god of war, and once you look into the eyes of the collective shadow, the civilized world never looks the same again. It becomes a thin veneer, a fragile glass floor over an ocean of chaos. To further understand the psychological fracture of the era, we must descend into the world of the trickster archetype, the domain of the spy. If the general represents the wise old man trying to impose order, the spy is the fluid, chaotic force that survives by having no true shape. In Jungian terms, the spy is a man who has surrendered his ego to a series of conflicting personas. During the war, intelligence officers were trained to be psychological chameleons. They didn't just wear an enemy's uniform. They were taught to inhabit the enemy's shadow. Imagine the mental toll of living as a double agent. You wake up every morning and put on a mask that contradicts your deepest values. You betray those who trust you to protect those who don't know you exist. Jung noted that this level of prolonged deception leads to a dissociation of the personality. The mind begins to leak. The boundaries between the lie and the truth become porous. Many of these men suffered from a peculiar form of vertigo, not of the heights, but of the soul. They looked into the mirror and saw a stranger, because the mask had eaten the face. This is why the most effective interrogations were never about physical pain. They were about identity erasure. Allied psychologists discovered that if you could convince a captured spy that his home was an illusion, or that his cause had abandoned him, his persona would shatter instantly. Without the mask of the ideology, the individual was left naked before their own shadow. They would talk, not because they wanted to betray their country, but because they were desperate to find a solid ground for their own existence. They needed the interrogator to tell them who they were. The battlefield of the mind was a hall of mirrors. The spy was the ultimate victim of the war's psychological machinery. While the soldier died for a flag, the spy died for a lie he had started to believe. Jung warned that the greatest danger to any civilization is the man who forgets his own name in service of a great idea. When the war finally ended, thousands of these shadow men remained among us, living in our neighborhoods, working in our offices, carrying secrets that their own minds had buried in the deepest layers of the unconscious. They are the silent ghosts of the 20th century, a reminder that the most dangerous place to be lost is not in the woods, but inside a false identity. As the conflict reached its climax, a new and terrifying archetype began to emerge from the collective unconscious, the destroyer of worlds. In 1945, at the Trinity test site in New Mexico, Robert Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, but he was describing a Jungian reality. The development of the atomic bomb was the ultimate inflation of the human ego. Man had finally tapped into the primordial power, the energy of the stars, and for a brief, blinding moment, the scientists and generals felt they had become the archetype itself. Jung believed that the God image is a permanent fixture of the human psyche. Usually, we project this image onto religions or philosophies. But during the war, this image was projected onto technology. The bomb wasn't seen as just a weapon. It was seen as a final judgment. This is the moment where the human ego stops serving life and begins to serve pure destruction. The pilots who carried these weapons were not merely soldiers. They were the angels of the apocalypse in a secular age. The psychological weight of this responsibility created a new kind of trauma, one that wasn't based on fear, but on a godlike guilt. This atomic ego changed the nature of human fear forever. Before the bomb, we feared the other, the enemy across the border. After the bomb, we began to fear ourselves. We realized that our shadow now had the power to delete the entire species. The war moved from a struggle between nations to a struggle for the survival of the human soul. Jung spent his final years writing frantically about this shift. He argued that our external technology had far outpaced our internal psychological development. We were monkeys with lightning bolts, children playing with the fundamental forces of the universe without the moral maturity to handle them. This realization is the true inheritance of World War II. We live in the shadow of that 1945 explosion every day. It forced a global dark night of the soul. We are now a species that knows it can commit suicide at any moment. This permanent state of anxiety has reshaped our politics, our art, and our mental health. The Cold War was simply a 40-year psychological standoff, a manifestation of the internal split within the global psyche. We weren't just afraid of missiles. We were afraid of the uncontrolled eruption, of the darkness that we all knew was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of our civilized masks. To truly understand why the mid-20th century felt like an eruption of ancient demons, we must look at the most dangerous psychological phenomenon of all: mythic inflation. Jung watched with horror as the leaders of the Third Reich didn't just play politics, they resurrected dead gods. By tapping into the ancient Germanic myths of Wotan and the warrior cults, they provided a starving population with something more addictive than food: meaning. But it was a poisoned meaning. They were no longer citizens of a modern state. They were living out a primordial epic. When a person, or a nation, identifies with a myth, they lose their human proportions. They become inflated. This is why the aesthetic of the era was so obsessed with the colossal. The massive rallies, the towering granite architecture, the obsession with purity. These were not just aesthetic choices. They were attempts to manifest the hero archetype in its most distorted and ego-driven form. Jung argued that when you try to be a god, you automatically invite the devil to balance the scale. The purity of the ideology required a corresponding impurity to hate, creating a psychological vacuum that could only be filled by blood. This was the Black Sun of the SS and the occult circles. They weren't just soldiers. They saw themselves as a new priesthood. They used symbols like the swastika, an ancient sun symbol, and inverted its meaning, turning it into a vortex that sucked the light out of the collective psyche. Jung noted that many of these men were in a state of possession. They weren't evil in the way we think of a criminal. They were something worse. They were pious servants of a dark archetype. They had surrendered their individual ego to a greater power that demanded the sacrifice of their humanity. Nowhere was the fracture of the soul more evident than in the medical experiments of the camps. This is the ultimate destination of the shadow when it is completely divorced from the anima, empathy. Jung studied how a man could be a loving father at breakfast and a clinical torturer by noon. The answer lies in a psychological mechanism called compartmentalization. The physician persona was used as a shield. By convincing themselves they were serving science or the future of the race, these men could perform atrocities without feeling guilt. In their minds, they weren't killing people. They were processing biological material. This is the peak of the dark sage we discussed earlier, the intellect that has completely severed its connection to the heart. When the ego becomes purely logical, it becomes a machine, and a machine feels nothing when it crushes a soul. Jung warned that this scientific shadow is still with us. It is the belief that progress justifies any cost. After the war, many of these death doctors and engineers were secretly brought to the West and East under programs like Operation Paperclip. They didn't change their psychology, they just changed their employers. They brought with them the cold, detached logic that would later fuel the Cold War's secret experiments on human behavior. They proved that the shadow doesn't need a uniform to function. It only needs a high-sounding justification and a laboratory. But what of those who were crushed by these gods and sages? The psychology of the victim is just as profound. In the camps and the bombed cities, a new archetype emerged: the survivor. Jung observed that in the face of absolute horror, the ego has two choices. It can vanish in a madness, or it can undergo a metamorphosis. Many survivors reported a strange sense of detachment, as if they were watching their own suffering from a distance. This is the soul's final defense. It is the emergence of what Jung called the self, the core of the psyche that cannot be destroyed by external fire. Those who survived with their minds intact often did so because they found a way to integrate the horror. They didn't just endure the pain. They transformed it into a deep, tragic wisdom. This is the wounded healer archetype. The people who saw the worst of humanity and returned to build a world based on human rights and empathy. They knew, better than any philosopher, that the line between good and evil doesn't run between nations, but directly through every human heart. Their trauma wasn't just a scar, it was a harrowing of hell. They had seen the shadow in its purest form, and live to tell the story. Their existence is the only real answer to the nihilism of war. As the wheels of war ground toward their inevitable end, many participants began to report a phenomenon that defied rational military logic. Jung called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seemed to suggest an underlying order in the chaos. Soldiers finding a Bible at the exact moment a bullet struck their chest. Generals making intuitive decisions that save thousands based on a sudden, inexplicable feeling. In the Jungian view, when the collective unconscious is in a state of high tension, the boundary between the internal mind and the external world thins. The war wasn't just happening on maps. It was a cosmic drama where fate seemed to step in. These moments of synchronicity were the psyche's way of reminding us that even in our darkest hour, we are part of a larger, mysterious pattern. It was the self trying to reestablish balance in a world that had gone insane. Script: The Shadow of the General, Part 11, The Final Judgment of the Mind. When the dust finally settled over the ruins of Europe and Asia, a different kind of trial began. Not just the Nuremberg trials, but a trial within the soul of every survivor. This was the crisis of meaning. After seeing the shadow unleashed, the modern world could no longer pretend that progress or education would save us. We had seen that the most educated minds could also be the most monstrous. The final judgment wasn't about what we did to the enemy, but what we allowed to happen within ourselves. Jung argued that the only real victory is the individualization, the process of a person becoming whole by facing their own darkness. He warned that if we simply buried the war without understanding its psychological roots, it would eventually return under a different name, a different flag, and a different mask. The war taught us that the greatest threat to humanity is not a dictator, but our own capacity for self-deception. Script: The Shadow of the General, Final Conclusion, The Mirror in the Rubble. So, we return to the quiet study in Zurich where Carl Jung watched the smoke rise from a distance. His message for the future was clear. The only way to keep the world safe is to keep your own soul in order. You cannot fight the shadow in the street if you haven't faced the shadow in your own mirror. World War II was the most expensive psychological lesson in human history. It showed us that we are not the masters of our own house. We are inhabited by ancient forces, kings, warriors, shadows, and sages that can seize control at any moment. The uniform is gone, the bunkers are empty, and the maps have been redrawn. But the psychological architecture remains. As you walk through your own life, remember the lessons of the general shadow. Every time you project your anger onto another, every time you wear a mask to gain power, and every time you ignore the darkness within, you are laying the bricks for the next great conflict. The war is never truly over. It has simply moved back into the unconscious. And there, in the silence of your own mind, the next battle has already begun.